The rain mashed against the windows like an angry tide, drowning out the hum of the city streets below. I sat at the dining table, wrapped in the comfort of an oversized sweater, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the pages of a book I wasn't really reading. Outside, the world felt distant, muffled by the storm. Inside, the quiet was heavy, almost suffocating. That's when it happened. 3 sharp knocks at the door shattered the stillness. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest as I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m., late enough to send a chill through my spine. Rising from my chair, I hesitated for a moment before crossing the room. The knocks came again, louder this time, more urgent. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the person standing there. It was my son, drenched from head to toe, his hair plastered to his forehead. A small suitcase rested at his gray feet, the wheels caked with mud. His eyes were red, his face pale. He looked like a ghost of himself, stripped of the warmth and laughter I had known. "Hey," he said, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the storm. "Come in," I urged, pulling him inside before he caught his death in the cold. He didn't argue, but his movements were stiff, as though every step cost him effort. I took the suitcase and set it by the door while he stood there, dripping onto the hardwood floor, his arms hanging limp at his sides. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Why are you here? What happened? Why didn't you call? But the look on his face stopped me. "It's over," he said finally, his voice cracking like an old record. "What's over?" I asked gently, though I already knew. "She left me," he whispered. His lips trembled as he spoke, and for a moment, he looked like a little boy again, the one who used to run to me after scraping his knee on the playground. My chest tightened, and I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry," I said softly. It felt woefully inadequate, but what else could I say? He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. I didn't know where else to go. "You're always welcome here," I assured him, guiding him toward the couch. "Let's get you out of those wet clothes." While he changed in the bathroom, I prepared a cup of tea, the familiar ritual grounding me in the moment. By the time he emerged, wearing an old hoodie and sweatpants from his teenage years, I had already set everything out on the coffee table. He sat down heavily, staring at the steam rising from his cup. "I really thought we were going to make it," he said after a long silence. I took a seat beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd him. "What happened?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. "I don't know. Maybe I missed the signs. Maybe she just stopped loving me." The raw vulnerability in his voice was almost too much to bear. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, not out of rejection, but because he was lost in his own turmoil. "I did everything I could," he continued, his voice rising slightly. "I thought if I worked harder, if I showed her how much she meant to me, it would be enough." "It's not your fault," I said firmly, "but it feels like it is," he countered, finally meeting my eyes. His gaze was full of unshed tears, a dam ready to burst. "I gave her everything, and it still wasn't enough. So what does that say about me?" "It says you loved her," I replied. "That's nothing to be ashamed of." For a moment, he seemed to consider my words, his expression softening. But then he shook his head, setting the mug down with a thud. "I need air," he muttered, heading for the balcony. I followed, watching as he leaned against the railing. The rain a distant drumbeat now. The city lights stretched out below us, a patchwork of warmth against the cold night. "I feel like I'm falling apart," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not," I said, standing beside him. "You're just hurt, and that's okay." He turned to me then, his eyes searching mine for something, comfort, reassurance, maybe just a reason to believe that the pain wouldn't last forever. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you keep going when everything feels like it's falling apart?" I thought about his father, about the years I had spent stitching myself back together after he left. "One day at a time," I said honestly, "and you don't have to do it alone." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, without warning, he wrapped his arms around me, holding on tightly as though I were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "There's nothing to be sorry for," I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. We stayed like that, 2 figures against the storm, the weight of the night pressing down on us, and yet as I held him, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. He had come to me, broken but willing to heal, and that was enough to start. The road to the cabin was longer than I remembered, winding through the dense forest that seemed to close in on us the farther we drove. The rain from the night before had left the air crisp, the smell of wet pine filling the car. My son sat in the passenger seat, his face turned toward the window, watching the landscape blur past. He hadn't said much since we left the city, and I hadn't pressed him. There was a comfort in the quiet, a reprieve from the storm of emotions that had followed him into my home. The cabin itself was small, nestled at the edge of a hill that overlooked a valley. It had belonged to my parents, a place of countless childhood summers filled with laughter and the freedom of endless days. But now, as we pulled up the gravel driveway, it seemed almost too still, like a snapshot of a time long past. "This is it," I said, cutting the engine. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, before stepping out of the car. I followed the crunch of gravel underfoot, breaking the silence. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and age. The furniture was simple but sturdy, the kind of pieces that could withstand generations of use. A faded quote draped over the couch, and the fireplace was already stocked with logs, waiting to be lit. "You still remember this place?" I asked, setting our bags near the staircase. "Yeah," he replied, his voice flat. "It feels smaller. It's always smaller when you grow up." He nodded absently, wandering over to the window that framed the valley below. I watched him for a moment. The way his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of his heartbreak was still pressing down on him. "Why don't you get settled?" I suggested. "I'll start on some lunch." He didn't respond, but eventually made his way upstairs. I busied myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a simple soup. The rhythm of the knife against the cutting board was soothing, a way to keep my mind from drifting too far into worry. When he finally came back down, his hair was damp from a shower, and he looked marginally more rested. He sat at the table, staring at his hands as I placed a bowl in front of him. "Thanks," he muttered. We ate in silence, the only sound the soft clink of spoons against raw porcelain. I wanted to ask him how he was feeling, if being here was helping at all, but I knew better than to push. Instead, I waited, letting the moment stretch out until he was ready to fill it. "Do you think people can just stop loving someone?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I set my spoon down, folding my hands in front of me. "I think love changes," I said carefully. "Sometimes it grows into something different. Sometimes it fades, but I don't think it ever really goes away." He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the soup in front of him. "It feels like I wasn't enough. Like if I had done something differently, maybe she would have stayed." "It's not about being enough," I said gently. "Sometimes people leave because they're looking for something they can't even name. It doesn't mean you failed." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know how to move on from this." "You don't have to know right now," I said. "It's okay to take your time." He nodded, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Later that afternoon, we decided to take a walk. The trail behind a cabin led to a small clearing by a stream, a place I remembered well from my childhood. The path was muddy from the rain, and we had to tread carefully to avoid slipping. When we reached the clearing, he stood at the edge of the stream, staring at the water as it rushed over smooth stones. "It's quiet here," he said. "Sometimes quiet is what we need," I replied. He turned to look at me, his expression softer than it had been all day. "I don't think I ever told you how much I appreciate you," he said suddenly. I was caught off guard, but I smiled. "You don't have to say it. I know, no, I do." He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "You've always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it." "Of course I've been there," I said. "That's what family is for." He took a step closer, and for a moment, the weight of his gaze made my breath hitch. Then, without warning, he leaned in and kissed me on the cheek, a fleeting gesture that lingered longer in the silence that followed. I blinked, unsure of what to say, but before I could speak, he stepped back, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I should head back," he muttered, already turning toward the trail. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The walk back to the cabin was quieter, the space between us filled with unspoken thoughts. I didn't know what to make of what had just happened, but I pushed the uncertainty aside. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat by the fireplace, the crackle of the flames filling the room. He seemed more at ease, his shoulders less tense, his expression less guarded. "It's going to take time," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. "But you'll get through this. I know you will." He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the firelight. And for the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled. It was faint, barely there, but it was real. "Thanks, Mom," he said softly. And for the first time, I felt like maybe we were both starting to heal. The morning light seeped through the cabin's old curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the wooden floor. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the beams settling into the warmth of the sun. I was in the kitchen pouring myself a second cup of coffee when I heard footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled, still wearing the hoodie he'd slept in. "Morning," he mumbled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Morning," I replied with a small smile, sliding a mug across the counter toward him. He took it, cradling the warmth in his hands. For a moment we stood in silence, the air between us calm but fragile, like the stillness before a storm. "You slept okay?" I ventured, trying to gauge his mood. He nodded vaguely, staring into the black surface of his coffee. "Yeah, better than I thought I would." I let that be enough, not wanting to push too hard. Instead, I busied myself with tidying the counter, my mind wandering to the attic. It had been years since anyone had set foot up there, but I remembered the boxes of old family photographs, the dusty remnants of a life that felt like someone else's now. "You want to help me with something?" I asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. He looked up, his brow furrowed. "What kind of something?" "There's a lot of junk in the attic that needs sorting," I said. "Could be a good way to kill some time." He hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure, why not?" We climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, the air growing cooler as we ascended. The door groaned on its hinges as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit space cluttered with boxes, trunks, and furniture shrouded in white sheets. Dust motes danced in the shafts of some lights streaming through the small window. "This place hasn't changed at all," he said, a faint note of nostalgia in his voice. I smiled, pulling the cover off an old rocking chair. "Feels like stepping back in time, doesn't it?" He didn't reply, already drawn to a stack of boxes, labeled in my father's neat handwriting. He crouched down, peeling the tape from one and lifting the lid. Inside were faded photographs, yellow letters, and a handful of trinkets that had once seemed so important. "Look at this," he said, holding up a picture of the two of us at the lake. He couldn't have been more than 8, grinning ear to ear with a fishing rod in hand, while I laughed beside him. "You caught your first fish that day," I said, taking the photo from him. "You were so proud you wouldn't let anyone else touch it." He chuckled softly, the sound unexpected but welcome. I forgot how happy I used to be. The common hung in the air, heavy with unspoken sadness. I glanced at him, searching for the right words, but before I could speak, he was already pulling out another photo. This one was of me and his father, taken on our wedding day. We looked impossibly young, full of hope and certainty about a future that hadn't turned out the way we'd planned. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" he asked, his tone cautious. I set the lake photo down carefully. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I've learned to be grateful for what I had. Even if it didn't last." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the picture. "I don't think I know how to let go like that." "It's not easy," I said. "It takes time, and sometimes it takes help." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "You're the only one who's ever really been there for me," he said quietly. I reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his arm. "You've always had me," I said, "and you always will." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he shifted, brushing his fingers against mine. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it carried a weight I couldn't quite name. Clearing my throat, I pulled my hand back and straightened. "Come on," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Let's see what else is in these boxes." We spent the rest of the morning sorting through the attic's treasures, each object pulling us deeper into the past. By the time we descended back to the main floor, the sun was high in the sky, and the cabin felt brighter, more alive. As we sat on the porch later, sipping lemonade and watching the forest weigh in the breeze, he turned to me. "Thanks for dragging me up there," he said. "Any time," I replied. "It's good to remember where we came from." He smiled faintly, and for a moment, the tension in his face seemed to ease. But as the shadows lengthened and the day gave way to dusk, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still standing on the edge of something neither of us fully understood. The morning started with an air of quiet determination. After days spent sorting through the attic and steeping in old memories, it felt like we needed a change of pace. Over breakfast, I suggested a drive to the small town nearby, a place with a market, a few shops, and enough distractions to lift our spirits. He hesitated at first, his gaze lingering on his coffee mug, like it held some answer he couldn't quite grasp. "Yeah," he said, eventually nodding. "That sounds good." The drive began in easy silence. The road twisted and turned through dense patches of trees, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Occasionally we passed an opening where the view stretched out over the valley, a breathtaking expanse of green and gold. He sat in the passenger's seat, his arm resting on the window frame, the wind tousling his hair. For the first time in days, he seemed lighter, as though the weight he carried had eased just enough to let him breathe. We arrived at the town just before noon. The streets were quiet, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other. I led us through the market, pointing out stalls selling fresh produce, handmade crafts, and jars of honey with labels scrawled in uneven handwriting. He didn't say much, but followed along, occasionally picking up an item and examining it with mild interest. When we stopped for ice cream at a small parlor, I noticed a faint smile tug at the corners of his mouth as he watched a fine group of kids chasing each other around a fountain. "It's nice here," he said, almost to himself. "It is," I agreed. "Sometimes a quiet place is exactly what we need." The day felt easy, almost normal. But as we headed back to the cabin, the car suddenly jolted, a sharp clunk echoing beneath us. "What was that?" he asked, sitting up straight. I pulled over to the side of the road, the car sputtering before falling silent. The forest loomed on either side, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of cicadas. "Stay here," I said, stepping out to investigate. He followed anyway, crouching beside me as I checked the tires and peered under the hood. "Do you even know what you're looking for?" he asked, half smirking. "Not really," I admitted, brushing my hands against my jeans. We both laughed, a brief, genuine sound that felt out of place against the backdrop of our predicament. "Well," I said, leaning against the car, "it looks like we're stuck for a bit." He sat down on the wet, grassy shoulder, leaning back on his hands. "Could be worse," he said, tilting his face toward the sky. I joined him, the two of us sitting in the warm afternoon light. The tension of the past few days seemed to dissolve in the quiet, replaced by a calm I hadn't felt in ages. "You know," he said after a while, "I didn't think coming here would help, but it's different now." "Different how?" I asked. He shrugged, picking at a blade of grass. "It's like I can think again, like I'm not drowning anymore." "That's good," I said softly. He turned to me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "It's because of you," he said simply. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I managed a small smile. "I think you're stronger than you realize," I said. "You're just starting to see it now." The moment hung between us, suspended in the golden light. Then, before I could say anything more, he leaned over and kissed my cheek. A fleeting gesture, so quick I barely registered it before he pulled back. His face flushed. "Sorry," he muttered, looking away. "It's okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Before the silence could grow awkward, the sound of an approaching car caught our attention. I stood, waving down the old pickup that pulled over to the side of the road. The driver, a weathered man in his 50s, offered to help. As he tinkered under the hood, my son and I stood to the side, watching the shadows lengthen across the road. "Think it'll start?" He asked, his tone light but hopeful. "We'll see," I said, glancing at him. The truck driver finally emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Tried now," he said, stepping back. I climbed into the driver's seat, turning the key. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. "Glad I could help," he replied, tipping his hat before driving off. As we continued our journey back to the cabin, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the road. He leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. "Today wasn't so bad," he said quietly. No, I agreed, it wasn't. When we pulled into the driveway, the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. As we stepped inside, he paused at the door, glancing back at the sky. "I think I'll be okay," he said almost to himself. I didn't reply, but his words stayed with me long after the dull stars appeared. The morning brought a crisp chill that seeped through the wooden slats of the cabin, a reminder that autumn was settling in. I woke to the sound of footsteps downstairs, the faint clatter of dishes telling me he was already awake. Throwing on a sweater, I made my way down, the warm scent of coffee wafting through the air. "Morning," he said without looking up, his focus on pouring 2 cups of coffee. His voice was lighter, almost casual, as though the weight of the past days had started to lift. "Morning," I replied, sitting at the table where he placed a steaming mug in front of me. "We should restock today," he suggested, gesturing toward the pantry. "We're running low on everything." It felt like progress, a small step forward. "Sounds like a plan," I said, taking a sip. The drive into town was quieter than usual, but not the heavy silence of before. It was companionable, filled with the soft hum of the radio and the occasional crackle of static as the road wound through the hills. The small grocery store was buzzing with locals, their chatter filling the aisles as we navigated through. He pushed the cart while I tossed in the essentials: bread, eggs, some fresh produce. As we turned a corner, I froze. There, by the bakery section, was a face I hadn't expected to see. It was her, his ex girlfriend. She was standing with a man I didn't recognize, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they laughed at something he'd said. My instinct was to shield him, to steer him away before he noticed, but it was too late. His gaze followed mine, his steps faltering as he saw her. "Do you want to leave?" I asked quietly. He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. The way his hands gripped the cart, the way his posture stiffened, it was all too familiar. I reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "We can come back later," I said. He shook his head again, this time more firmly. I said, "I'm fine." We continued shopping, but the encounter had cast a shadow over the rest of the trip. He was quieter than usual, his responses clipped. When we passed her again near the checkout, she glanced up, her eyes widening in recognition. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the man at her side touched her elbow, drawing her attention back to him. She hesitated, then looked away, leaving the moment unspoken. The ride back to the cabin was suffocating. He stared out the window, his jaw set, while I gripped the steering wheel, unsure of what to say. When we got back, he grabbed one of the grocery bags and headed inside without a word. I followed. The tension in the air so thick it felt like a storm about to break. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked as he unloaded the bags onto the counter. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice sharp. "You saw her," I said gently. "I said I'm fine," he snapped, slamming a box of cereal onto the counter. The sound echoed in the small kitchen, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to yell." "It's okay," I said, moving closer. "You're allowed to feel upset." He nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "It's just seeing her like that. With him, it's like she's already forgotten everything we had." "She hasn't forgotten," I said. "People deal with things in different ways. It doesn't mean what you had wasn't real." He leaned against the counter, his shoulders slumping. I thought I was getting better. I thought I was starting to move on. "You are," I said. "But healing isn't a straight line. It's okay to have setbacks." He looked at me, then his eyes searching mine. "You always know what to say," he said softly. I smiled faintly. "Not always, but I try." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of small tasks, putting away groceries, tidying up the living room, chopping vegetables for dinner. By the time the sun began to set, the tension had eased, though the weight of the day still lingered. After dinner, we sat on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around us. The stars were brighter here, unspoiled by city lights, their brilliance stretching endlessly across the sky. "You were right," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "About what?" "That is not a straight line." "I guess I just wanted it to be. It's natural," I said. "But progress isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up when you do." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. We sat there for a while longer, the silence between us no longer heavy but soothing, like a balm for old wounds. And for the first time, since that fateful night he arrived at my door, I felt like we were both starting to find our way. The fire crackled softly in the cabin's hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, the sound blending seamlessly with the warmth of the room. We sat together on the old couch, a blanket draped over our knees, the remains of dinner left forgotten on the table. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what?" I asked, glancing over at him. He hesitated, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the fabric of the couch. "About everything. About what's next." The weight of his words hung in the air. Over the past few weeks, I had seen him wrestle with his pain, fight through his grief, and stumble towards something resembling hope. Now, for the first time, it felt like he was ready to face the future. "I can't stay like this forever," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Hiding here, avoiding the world. It's not who I want to be." I reached over, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," I said. "But you're right. You deserve more than this. More than holding on to something that isn't there anymore." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I think I'm ready to go back," he said, meeting my gaze. "To the city, to my life." Even if it's hard, my heart swelled with pride. But there was also a bittersweet pain. The time we had spent here, as painful as it had been, had brought us closer, in a way I hadn't expected. Letting him go meant letting this chapter end. "I'll miss having you here," I admitted. "I'll miss it too," he said softly. "But I'll come back. Not like this, though." Next time it'll be different. I smiled, squeezing his arm. It'll be better. We sat in silence for a while, the fire's glow warming the room. Then he shifted, leaning forward and pulling a small box from his pocket. My breath caught as he held it out to me. What's this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Open it, he said. I did, finding a small silver pendant inside, a delicate tree etched into the metal. It's beautiful, I said, my throat tightening. It reminded me of this place, he explained, of everything it gave us. I blinked back, tears clutching the pendant tightly. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling. As the fire began to die down, we both looked out the window at the endless expanse of stars. It was a moment I wanted to hold on to forever, a quiet acknowledgement that while the pain wasn't gone, we had found something stronger, a bond that neither distance nor time could break. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest end of pine, and for the first time I felt the promise of something new.